You can see me afterwards for those. Just teasing. Okay. No, it's great to have this turnout, as if I bribed you. There's a famous poem by John Donne in which the poet lamented in the 1600s that the circles had been broken. And by that he meant that the medieval model of the cosmos and all of its harmonic perfection seemed to be falling apart in light of the new scientific discoveries. He said, "And new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation, or relation." The last line of Donne's poems are especially telling. "'Tis all in pieces, all just supply and all relation." They refer not only to the mechanization of the heavens, but also the mechanization of the world picture at the level of particles. In other words, modern scientists can tell us a lot about what the world's like and how it's made and how it works, but they struggle with the question, what is the world for? As contemporary physicist Steven Weinberg famously said, "As the universe has grown more comprehensible to science, the more pointless it also seems," end quote. And it is this reason that Romanticism is such an exciting intellectual movement. Beginning sometime around 1798 and continuing to sometime around, say, 1850, the artists, poets, and intellectuals, thinkers, especially in Germany and England, who grew up in this time were driven by the desire to recover meaning in the natural world and a place for the spirit and a place for the arts without rejecting the findings of modern physics, biology, and chemistry. In fact, they wondered if the divorce between the arts and the sciences could actually be healed. Friedrich Schlegel put it, "All art must become science, and all science must become art." And it was this desire that would eventually compel Tolkien and Lewis 100 years later, who might be thought of the last of the Romantics. Well, the last of the Romantics, but one. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Dwight Lindley, who will talk to us about why Romanticism still matters. Dr. Lindley holds a chair in English at Hillsdale College, where he was one of the most loved faculty members on campus. He's an expert in the thought of John Henry Newman and Charles Dickens, but he's also working on a book called Taking Literature Personally, The Place of Poetry in Human Life. Please help me welcome him to the podium for tonight's talk about Romanticism.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? I also wanted to mention, he mentioned John Henry Newman. I'm happy to give this lecture today, partially because Newman was one of the first people who really, I think, opened my eyes to certain aspects of Romanticism, and today's his feast day. So, ora pro nobis. Midway through a romantic novel you've probably never heard of, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, 1802, by Novalis, a strange but utterly transcendent scene unfolds. Our protagonist, the Heinrich of the title, this is a German work, in case you can't tell, has just fallen in love with a beautiful young woman, Matilda, when he dreams of her death by drowning. After an anxious few minutes of looking for the body, he realizes, still in the dream, that she is with him, and they are both, in fact, underwater. This happens sometimes. Don't you see its blue waves above us, she says? Assuring Heinrich that they will now be together forever, Matilda kisses him, embracing him tightly, quote, so that she could not be separated from him again. She uttered a marvelous secret word to him that penetrated his entire being. He was about to repeat it, the narrator tells us, when his grandfather called and woke him up. He would have given his life to know what that word was. Close quote. It is a beguiling and uncanny scene. But what can a dream of an underwater kiss signify? And what is the word that she speaks to him? The fact that Heinrich can't quite recall it is important. It's right there at the tip of his tongue, but remains inchoate. And it also seems significant that the word is spoken while her lips are pressed to his, spoken into his very flesh. It's a hard way to speak, by the way. Spoken into his very flesh. It is as though he has known the word with his body, but cannot bring it distinctly into audible speech. In the context of the novel as a whole, the watery word is further colored by Novalis' dominant motif of the blue flower, die blaue Blume, which signifies the transcendent object of Heinrich's desire. Throughout this novel, he's searching for the blue flower. Where will I find it? The object of his desire, the infinite, as it calls to him through the finite. This is what this flower kind of represents in the novel. The whole novel is constituted by the quest for this flower, and that longing, or Sehnsucht in German, is symbolically fulfilled in the word of the kiss under blue water. Without dwelling longer on Novalis' blissed-out image, I would suggest that it is a late modern version of a phenomenon we see many other times in the tradition, the call of the one word. It is, of course, the Logos of John's Gospel, the word through whom all things were called into existence, the light shining in the darkness to which all created things turn with desire. In the authoritative interpretation of St. Augustine, this one word, the verbum, is that by which we are both made and remade, called into being from nothingness, and then recalled from the nothingness of our sin into the depths of God's divine life. Quote, you have made us for, or you have made us, the Latin is fecisti nos ad te, you have made us toward yourself. And our heart is unquiet or restless until it rests in you. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa put it very clearly 1,000 years later. Quote, from the very beginning of time, our Savior gave expression in each of his followers to but one utterance, and this gradually grew in strength until it became that loud voice with which he cried out at the moment he expired. The message this one voice gives is that apart from the Word, there is no life, and that just as the world issued from the Word, so too through the Word is it preserved in existence and brought back to its source. This one voice is ceaselessly calling God's creatures, and the word with which it calls is Christ himself, the divine Logos incarnate and present in all things. If there is no life apart from this word, and all necessarily hear it, then we can also say that the lives of individual humans and of human cultures define themselves by their response to it. As the late French philosopher Jean-Louis Chrétien wrote, all life can be helpfully understood as a symphony of complex, interlinked calls and responses. Though, of course, all that complexity can be simplified down into the one call of the creative word and the sub-creative responses of all creation. It is edifying, though, to single out the beautiful responses made to the word by individual lives, saints, artists, thinkers, and other people of integrity, but also the responses of great cultures and movements. Of the great cultural responses to the one word, we can single out those of classical Athens, Hellenistic Alexandria, the rich field of the patristic period, all the various renaissances of medieval and early modern Europe, and finally, Romanticism. This series of variegated but unified responses is what we mean by the tradition. This is just a definition of the tradition that I like. It's the series of excellent responses that have been made to the one creative call of God. The tradition. And every sort of traditional curriculum is trying to familiarize us with the greatest cultural moments and artifacts in the series, so that we might hear the one in the many. This is because, as Chrétien pointed out, we humans are so constituted that we hear the call in the response. The truth of this claim stands out in matters both small and great. I know that my attempts at humor are well aimed and appropriate based on whether my wife ignores them, 1, smiles, 2, or laughs out loud, best case scenario. I see the quality of my call in her response, But the same is true of great cultural artifacts. Bernini's piazza and colonnade in front of St. Peter's, or Tchaikovsky's first violin concerto, or Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. They each richly reflect the calls heard by their makers, that sense of what was required of them, what needed to be done, what could be accomplished in each of these places and times. And of course, there is also the deeper call of the one creative word echoing symphonically through all of those different responses. Today, I want to reflect on the last movement I mentioned, Romanticism, and its unique set of responses to the call, especially as manifested in Germany and England, basically the first major centers of this movement. This engagement, I think, will clarify our own vocation today and how we might answer it. My thesis is that we need a new Catholic romanticism for the present day, a romanticism both priestly and nuptial, as our way of responding to the call of the one word. First, though, why turn to Romanticism rather than any of those other great cultural movements I listed? We should never be forced to choose one culture alone for study or imitation. But there are reasons for giving romantic thought and culture special attention. For one, our world, and these are things that Dr. Baxter touched on in the intro, our world is uniquely similar to the world in which Romanticism arose. At the turn of the 19th century, commerce and society were rapidly industrializing. People all over the first world were pulling up their roots and moving to the cities. And the dominant economic and philosophical justifications for all these changes were cold and utilitarian. Greater centralization of the population and the means of production would lead to greater efficiency, more and better consumer products, and a higher quality of life. Though there would be growing pains, scattered families, lost cultures, impoverished urban slums, and so on, if you've ever read like Bleak House by Dickens, or frankly any Dickens novel, these urban slums which were realities, in his world. Though there would be these growing pains, they would be all worth it in time. That was the line. Today, we live in a society that is still advancing the same industrial project. Though now it is our own bodies, reproductive systems, minds, and intimate relationships that we are industrializing. I'm thinking of sex reassignment, IVF and other conception technologies, cloning and genetic enhancement programs, and so forth. Defining marks of what the writer Mary Harrington calls our, quote, cyborg era. Cyborg era. She's like, we're making ourselves into cyborgs intentionally. Isn't that the bad thing that happens in the sci-fi movies? It's not good. It's all worth it, we are told, even as our over-technologized culture moves deeper into depression and isolation. 200 years ago, Romanticism pushed back against heartless industrialism and cultural fragmentation, not by promoting mere nostalgia for the pre-industrial, unenlightened past, as is sometimes thought. I should say, they were capable of nostalgia, of course, but that was not the heart of it, and it's not the best of it. But by asking, how can we hear and respond to the one word now in the modern world? The best of the Romantics understood that only a positive project would work as a counterbalance to modern dehumanization, something to live and die for now, today. And I think we could learn a lot from their response. At the same time, I am proposing here not just a new Romanticism, but a new Catholic Romanticism. It must be Catholic because, as we shall see, Romanticism has often gone awry for want of trustworthy divine revelation, doctrinal clarity, and accountability. Significantly, Romantic thinking tended to arise first in majority Protestant cultures. In England and Germany, there was a Catholic minority in Germany, and a very small Catholic minority in England. But these are basically dominant Protestant cultures. That's where it grows first, and it's not accidental. After that, it spreads to Poland, France, Italy, and so on. Okay. So in these non-Catholic countries, where the pursuit of transcendent encounter with the divine was not as much shaped by church teaching, and so the original Romantics often overreached, straying into heresy in their zeal for dynamic response to what William Blake called the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. They were seeking what Catholics would identify as a sacramental way of life, a life in which we can meet God in everyday embodied ways, but in churches and cultures that had fewer clear teachings about sacraments. And so they frequently pushed their formulations further than Catholics at the time would have. Quote, "For the perfect Christian," said Friedrich Schlegel in 1799, "everything would really have to be a mediator of God." Close quote. A beautiful thought, but it is easy to slip into a vague pantheism, as many later Romantics have, without the right kind of doctrinal framing. If we are to receive and make good use of Romanticism's inspiration, we need to do so as Catholics. So what I now want to do is work through two key dimensions of Romantic thought and practice that can help us respond to the Word and renew our culture today. The first, priestly, as I said, and the second, nuptial. The priestly dimension, first, needs to be understood as an effort to extend something like the Catholic vision of priesthood to all people working in all parts of life. But not in the first place by Catholics, as I said, which is interesting. The first Romantics responded to the cold, secularizing space of the modern economic and urbanizing life by insisting that all humans are basically religious, and that religion is fundamentally mediatory and sacrificial. Religion, wrote Friedrich Schlegel, is the all-animating world soul of culture, giving it meaning and purpose by relating it clearly to the infinite. To understand things, their meaning and purpose, is to see them in God, and to work with them, to do constructive work in the world, is to lift their creaturely finitude into the infinity of God. When I design and make a table, or any product, material or immaterial, a program or a spreadsheet, right today, I am taking an existing thing, seeing what it can be, which means seeing it in God, right, in the mind of God, and then developing it, shaping it in light of that vision. Because God is the source of all that being is and can be, and because we humans are the ones who work by seeing those potentialities, our life is fundamentally religious, whether we realize it or not. As Schlegel's friend Novalis put it, our entire life is divine service, in the sense that we cannot perfect it without seeing it in some sense in God. To work is to bring God's plan into being, at least in some way. And we may now add that this basically religious aspect of everyday life is also fundamentally priestly, inasmuch as it receives the gift of the world, then gives it back with an addition, offering it up sacrificially. In his novel Hyperion, the Romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin, Hölderlin's protagonist, comes to see himself as a priest of nature, not in a strictly pagan sense, but inasmuch as he receives the natural world as a gift of love, brings out the spiritual meaning he sees in it, then offers it back with that addition. In Schlegel's 1799 novel, Lucinda, The protagonist calls himself a priest of love and means it in a similar way. He realizes all life as a gift of love, which he is called to give back with praise. While the poet John Keats spoke of himself similarly as a priest of psyche or the soul, the English Romantics do not use the language of priesthood as much as the Germans, though the model is fundamentally the same. William Wordsworth, the English poet, declared in his autobiographical poem, The Prelude, that the sun, now that he has seen it, is no longer the same and cannot be. Quote, "An auxiliar light came from my mind, which on the setting sun bestowed new splendor. The melodious birds, the fluttering breezes, fountains that run on, murmuring so sweetly in themselves, obeyed a like dominion, and the midnight storm grew darker in the presence of my eye." Close quote. Wordsworth's offering changes the object before him, but not in a distorting way. The sun arouses what he calls a spirit of religious love in him, and the auxiliar light that comes from his mind exists in order to serve and magnify the nature of that sun, to bring out more fully what it is. Just so, every priestly offering I make takes up whatever is before me, draws out the spiritual meaning or potential in it, and offers it back up to God and to the world. That is what Romantic poetry is, this way of life that they were trying to spread all around them. Now, the Catholic tradition has already, in part, received and incorporated this Romantic priestliness into its spiritual practice. Across Europe and the Americas, the 19th century was marked deeply by Romanticism. This is a kind of transcontinental phenomenon, influenced all of the Western world at that time. And Catholics were not immune to this. We can think, for example, of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose poetry everywhere models this broad priestly vocation. He, of course, was a priest, but I'm talking about a kind of like this specifically Romantic understanding of what that is. His poetry models this broad priestly vocation, catching up a creaturely phenomenon, be it a wind-blown falcon or a laboring blacksmith or a scenic waterfall, drawing out the spiritual meaning within it and offering it back up. Take, for example, Harrowing and Harvest. Okay, I'm going to read this poem for you. This is a good poem for this time of year. Right? Summer ends now. Now, barbarous in beauty, the stooks rise around. Up above, what wind walks, what lovely behavior of silk-sack clouds, has wilder, willful wavier, meal drift, molded ever and melted across skies. I walk, I lift up my heart, eyes, down all that glory in the heavens to glean our Savior. And eyes, heart, what looks, what lips yet give you a rapturous love's greeting of realer, of rounder replies. And the azurous hung hills are his world-wielding shoulder, majestic as a stallion stalwart, very violet sweet. These things were here, and but the beholder wanting, which too, when they once meet, the heart rears wings bold and bolder, and hurls for him, half hurls earth for him off under his feet. Here, Hopkins does the same thing that Wordsworth did in his Prelude. He receives the harvest time vision, barbarous in beauty, of all the corn and wheat bound into stooks. These are those kind of like bound together grain bundles. The wind and the silk sack clouds, and in the fullness of it all, a land that has yielded up its fruit sacrificially. He perceives the image of our Savior. Christ's presence is nearly physical, Atlas-like, with the azurous hung hills as his world-wielding shoulder majestic. Hopkins' own gift, ultimately, is to receive the experience of this place at a particular moment in time, add to it his spiritual vision, and give it back poetically to God and to all of us. The poem is a priestly act, not the same as what Father Hopkins offered on the altar, but analogous to it. In his private theological notebook, Hopkins made clear the priestly character of his poetics. A note he made in 1882, these are notes that he wrote reflecting on the exercises of St. Ignatius. He was a Jesuit. So this note he made in 1882 describes all creation as a communication of God, an utterance of himself. This world, then, is word, expression, news of God. Therefore, its end, its purpose, its purport, its meaning is God, and its life or work to name or praise him. End quote. The arc he is tracing runs in a circle from God the Word down into the world that is his self-expression, back to God in the naming and praising of his creatures. Praise, he says, should be put before reverence and service. The world, man, should after its own manner give God being in return for the being that he has given it, or should give him back that being he has given. Okay, so when we're praising, we're actually giving back the gift of being that we've been given. This gift we make back to God is, for Hopkins, distinctly priestly, inasmuch as it is done, quote, by the great sacrifice, in which our suffering self-gift comes to participate in his. Quote, to contribute then to that sacrifice, he says, is the end for which man is made. With this theological framing exemplified in so many of his poems, Hopkins draws the wilder romantic mode of priestly poetic offering into a more disciplined, distinctly Catholic framework. In the broader Catholic spiritual tradition of the last 150 years, Saints Thérèse of Lisieux and José María Escrivá have applied Hopkins' kind of romantic priestliness to the everyday lives of all the faithful. The most trivial aspects of life were now to be the site of priestly offering, well beyond the walls of the church and the seven sacraments. This is a way in which I'm saying Catholic spirituality of the last 150 years has been influenced by romantic currents that initially came actually from outside of Catholicism and have fed Catholicism then. The little way of St. Therese was to receive the smallest objects, blessings, and trials as gifts directly from our Lord, to be spiritually interpreted and sacrificially offered up in union with him on the cross. Quote, whatever has come from God's hands, she wrote, has always pleased me, even those things which have seemed to me less good and less beautiful than the gifts made to others. Each day, she wrote, quote, I think of the pains and the sufferings awaiting me, and I rise, feeling all the more courageous and light of heart, in proportion to the opportunities I foresee of proving my love for our Lord and of gaining grace for others. Then I kiss my crucifix. Close quote. Each object of her attention is a gift to be offered, a site of encounter. It is the same dynamic we saw earlier in Schlegel, Novalis, and Wordsworth, but now clearly brought into the concrete framework of divine revelation and our relationship with Christ on the cross. St. Josemaria, who liked to call himself, quote, the last of the romantics, contrary to what Dr. Baxter said, brought this spirituality even deeper into the life of the faithful, teaching the universal call to holiness in the middle of the world precisely through the development of a certain kind of priestly soul. Even though you may not be a priest, he added. He thought everybody should have a priestly soul, all lay people too, in their own mode. Your desk, he would say, or wherever you work, is your altar. There, take what you have been given, your tasks, your property, your responsibilities, and offer them up in union with the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Again, we see here the romantic inheritance moving into the life of the church, where it can be received as a blessing, purified and extended. And we have only just begun this project, I think. Everyday Catholics in the pews, as we know, are still in the process of receiving the universal call to holiness. Sometimes it feels like that's an understatement, and taking on the priestly dimension of all walks of life, especially lay life. Now, in a cold, increasingly algorithmized online world, our task is to recover the richly religious, priestly dimension of all life as an offering back to the Father of lights, from whom all things descend. By embracing the right kind of romantic priestliness, we can change the world. Now, a second key dimension of Romanticism we need to think about is its nuptial character. I would argue that the Romantics wanted to bring out the sacramental depth of marriage, and then, as with priesthood, apply it to our relation to all things. In an increasingly enlightened world of self-interest, impersonal causes, whether in physics or economics, and rationalism, the Romantics championed love, and eros especially, as the height of life's meaning, and a key to our creative engagement with the world. Of course, everyone associates Romanticism with love in certain shallow ways, but the original German and English Romantics saw love, and especially the erotic desire that leads to nuptial union and procreation, as the essential ingredient in all parts of human life. First, consider the relation between the mind and individual objects. Quote, "In the truest sense," thought Novalis, "doing philosophy is a caress." That's what he said, caress. It's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? With this provocative description, he meant that things in the world draw us to think about them, attracting our attention as does the touch of a desired person. Reciprocally, when we reach toward objects with our minds, we are caressing them. It is an act of fondness and ultimately of love. Friedrich Schlegel takes it a step further. When we write about something, he said, we are joining ourselves to the object of our attention in a nuptial, procreative way, our love leading to a kind of union with the object and the begetting of a new being, the piece of writing. Publishing, said Schlegel, is to thinking as the maternity ward is to the first kiss. That's actually a crazy thing to say if you think about it. Publishing is to thinking as the maternity ward is to the first kiss. I say this to freak my students out about their papers that they're working on. The point here is not to make our writing projects into some kind of tawdry affair. I mean, I really don't believe that. But to root them in a nuptial anthropology, according to which it is of the essence of a human being to join him or herself to the world, and out of that union to bring forth new and beautiful creatures. The poetry, essays, articles, and books we write are things that have never existed before, sprung out of our love for the world we have encountered. Just as our relation to the world is fundamentally priestly, so too it is essentially conjugal. Take it another step, however. What about our relationship with other minds? For Novalis, it is clear that any conversation between persons, but especially a moment of teaching or argumentation, will feature a serious conjugal dimension. Quote, "Someone speaking," he says, "thinks and produces. Someone listening reflects and reproduces." Close quote. This startling metaphor suggests that the logos of the speaker seeds thoughts in the hearer, which then grow up within him or her into fully developed ideas. Novalis' first book was called Blütenstaub, in German, it's pollen. I wrote these things to pollinate the minds of my readers. It's a similar thing. Okay. Over time, we gestate the thoughts that have begun through encounters with other people throughout the day. A couple of corollaries follow for our everyday engagements with one another. First, it's important not to over-explain one's ideas, for this effaces the role of the receiver and is therefore one-sided and less interesting. Boring talkers are people who say too much. They over-explain. They don't give you the thing and then actually make you responsible for it. Let it grow up within you. As Novalis puts it, quote, "If the pupil genuinely desires truth, it requires only a hint to show him how to find what he is seeking." Close quote. Not a complete and tedious explanation. The freedom of the other's response is crucial here. And a second corollary is that all conversation, all thinking, all philosophy must be collaborative, with each person both giving and receiving thoughts about the object of their conversation. Thus, through mutual love and interest, the two conversationalists generate a new and shared sense of the thing that they are talking about. True collaboration in philosophy, says Novalis, is a common movement toward a beloved world, a world that grows through our communal nuptial engagement with it. The nuptial relation, though, stands out not just between person and thing, but also person and person. The next step is to extend the nuptial analogy not just to intellectual activities, but to all of life, as the Romantics did in their works. All three of the novels I mentioned so far, Schlegel's Lucinda, Novalis' Heinrich von Ofterdingen, and Hölderlin's Hyperion, feature male protagonists in love with specific women. But what is uniquely romantic about them is that each one uses his love for the woman as a lens through which to see his relationship with the whole world. The narrator protagonist of Lucinda, for example, finds the key to his whole life in his love for the title character. Quote, "Only here do I see myself complete and harmonious, or rather, I see all of humanity in me and you." The novel, in fact, uses their love to explore all the ways in which each human being is meant to love and seek unity with all other people and things. In some sense, we are meant to be married to everyone and everything. These are the kind of crazy thoughts that these guys had. I'm married to everything. It's kind of stressful, actually. Seeing this, Schlegel's narrator, his name is Julius, describes what he has found in the third person. Quote, "A light entered his soul. He saw and surveyed all the parts of his life and the structure of the whole clearly and truly, because he stood at its center as a kind of spouse to the world. He felt that he would never lose this unity. The mystery of his life had been resolved, and he had found the word. It seemed to him that everything in his life had been predestined and created since the beginning of time, so that he would find the answer in love." Close quote. The love he has for this one person has thus opened out into a love for all things, a love both unitive and procreative in some sense. To hear the call to this love for the Romantics is to hear the one word that speaks all into existence. On the English side, we find the same model of nuptial union with the world, though more modestly described, in accord with the English temperament. Stiff upper lip, In a poem laying out his chief goals as a poet, William Wordsworth speaks of, quote, "paradise and groves Elysian, the heavenly place where all is as it should be," and claims that these are not things merely of the past, not just the Garden of Eden. Quote, "For the discerning intellect of man, when wedded to this goodly universe in love and holy passion, shall find these places of perfection, a simple produce of the common day." Close quote. What he means is that when the human mind comes together with all of nature, this goodly universe, the combination of the two begets a vision of all things as they were really meant to be. When we look upon nature with love, thought Wordsworth, we see all that she is capable of, all that she might be and will be in the fulfillment of all things, something like the new heavens and new earth prophesied in Scripture. And we bring this out in what he calls the spousal verse of our minds, where the quote, "great consummation of human and world comes together." Here, as among the Germans, marriage is the fundamental fact about our relationship, not just with a spouse, but with all things. John Keats's 1819 sonnet, Bright Star, which I talked about with some of the students this afternoon, draws out a more physical dimension of this nuptial relationship. The poem develops a tension between two positions, that of a lofty, rational view from above, and a fully embodied, tactile presence down below. I'm going to quote this poem for you. Forgive me, those of you who already heard it today. Actually, don't forgive me. You should count yourself lucky to hear this poem twice. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite. The moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest. Still, still, to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. Of the many things that one could say about this poem, and I said other things this afternoon, the important point here tonight is that the speaker cannot bear to occupy some kind of abstraction, like the bright star hung aloft the night. That position represents the chilly rationalism of modern philosophy and economic theory. Rather, he must remain literarily in touch with the beloved, pillowed upon her living, breathing body. What keeps this poem from being a mere sensualist fantasy, right, which you could be forgiven for thinking, what keeps it from being a mere sensualist fantasy is the close connection Keats draws between the earth looked down on by the star and the body of the beloved felt by the lover. The soft fall of her breathing chest echoes the soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. It repeats the word soft fall. It echoes the soft fallen mask that the star is looking down on, the mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. The implication is that the distant stationary objects beheld by the star could be close and moving, like the body of the beloved, if only love could have its way. The whole earth is living, moving, growing, and eliciting the eros of human observers. And that eros must be pursued physically, not just mentally. In the Romantic imagination, the nuptial relation between human and world is not just mental, but whole personal. In the 2 centuries since the first Romantics began to develop this philosophy, and I'm coming in for a landing now, this is getting close to the end. So in those 2 centuries, since they were writing about these things, their idea of our nuptial connection to the world has been very influential in the literary tradition. Both Melville's Moby Dick and Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, for example, thematize marriage as the fundamental analogy for humans' relationship with things. I'm not going to make those arguments, but that's something I would claim about those 2 novels. But the Catholic tradition, it must be admitted, has been a little slower to draw upon this modern source in the development of its art and spirituality. John Paul II's theology of the body, of course, has dramatically extended our understanding of marriage, rooting it more clearly than ever in the Trinitarian image of God. The earlier tradition of the Church, too, patristic and medieval, has richly developed the analogy between human and divine love in the centuries of reflections on the biblical Song of Songs, for instance. There, it is clear that the erotic love of the human speakers in the Song of Songs reflects the relation of God to his church, but also God and each individual soul. What remains to be drawn out is the way that God's conjugal relation to his people, imaging as it does the relations among the Trinitarian persons, sheds light on the relation between us humans and the world in which we live. If God is love, and his love is in some deep sense nuptial, then we who are made in his image must also have something nuptial about all our love, even for the smallest things. This is what the Romantics think, and I think they might be right about that. Of course, we will have to apply the rule of analogy judiciously. My love for this cup of coffee, okay, I don't have a cup of coffee, for this bottle of water, my love for this bottle of water, for that professional acquaintance, for the Missouri River, will not be as fully nuptial as my love for my wife, just as my love for her will not be nearly as nuptial as my love for God. There can be a sliding scale here, as in all things. But for now, it's enough to note that Romanticism still has something to teach us as modern Catholics on our earthly pilgrimage. Just as Therese and Jose Maria learned from Romanticism how to enhance their priestly spirituality, we may turn to Romantic nuptial thinking as we continue to develop a spirituality of love in everyday life. And I think we need to do that, right, in the current problematic situation that I described at the start. Finally, my proposal here is that Romanticism, a movement that began outside of the Catholic Church and drew on Catholic sources in strange new ways, can now be profitably woven back into the Catholic tradition. Indeed, if we are to renew Catholic spirituality and imagination today, as we must, then I believe we must draw more on Romanticism's deep reflections, purifying them as we go, and synthesizing whatever is true there with a deposit of faith. Romanticism is a philosophy of love for everyday life, and it is precisely there, in all parts of this creaturely world, that we Catholics need help learning how to love. If all of us are to respond to the call of the one word today, wherever we are, even when we're at the bottom of some river kissing the girl of our dreams, then Romanticism is here to help. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we'll just treat this about the length of a class on a Tuesday or Thursday. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions, discussion. I can bring you a microphone if you would like to ask Dr. Lindley something.
So you said, just throughout the talk, you said a lot about the benefits and good things about Romanticism, especially at the end. I guess what I'm looking for is, what are some how do we go about this practically? How do we go about that? What does a physical relationship with the beauty of the world look like?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think a physical relationship with the beauty of the world, first of all, just means going out and engaging it with your body, feeling it, seeing it, making things out of it. I think actually can be building things with natural. With the natural products of the world, I think can be actually a fruitful way of engaging and affirming the creatures in the world. Being a good woodworker, I think actually could be, if you're sensitive to the things that you're working with, then even building things out of them, which means breaking them down in a certain sense, can be a way of respecting it lovingly and making your response to it affirmatively. But I think even going and sitting under the tree to read your book this afternoon could also do that physically. So there are all kinds of, there are a bunch of different ways. I think you could do that. Those are just what spring to mind. We got one right here in the front. Oh, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for your talk. Is this something that Western civilization as a culture needs, or just like within the Catholic Church?
That's a good question. I mean, I think what's good for the church is good for the culture is a cheap answer, but I mean, I think, I think if it's good for one, it's good for the other. I think Romanticism, and frankly, all of those great movements that I mentioned in the life of the West, these great cultural efflorescences, all the Renaissances and so on, they're all dangerous if they're received in the wrong way, in the sense that they can go awry and into error this way and that, because they're trying new things. And they're exciting, and they're pushing beyond the limits of what has been done in certain respects in response to the challenge of the day, you know? So what I'm driving toward is there are dangers in the culture at large that they are going to have, there are dangers in Romanticism that the culture at large might have a hard time avoiding sometimes without the help of the tradition and the magisterium. Not to say that it's going to be, we've got it made in the Catholic Church. We have our own problems and our own difficulties, but we at least have divine revelation. So I think that it is good in both areas because it's a way of affirming real reality and real truths in new and beautiful ways. And that the good outweighs the bad. I think all true and good and beautiful things like that can lead to the fullness of the truth. And so I would promote it throughout the culture. I mean, especially in this, as I said, increasingly algorithmized world where we're industrializing our bodies and all of that. I mean, I think that's very, like, Industrial Revolution has moved in, you know? And we very much need a dynamic movement in response. And I think that'll be attractive beyond the walls of the church and could work for good in spite of the dangers. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
When you said dangerous just now, it made me want to know what you think about what Romanticism has to teach us about appreciating danger. So you're talking about the Word, and I was thinking about some of the most striking moments when the incarnate Word is associated with danger, right? He says, "I am," and people pick up stones. He says, "I am," and they fall back and fall to the ground, right? He says, he quiets the storm, right, with a word. So my question is, do you think that we today have a problem that we fail to appreciate danger and that we suffer from that? And does Romanticism have something to teach us about how to have a better relationship with danger?
I mean, I think we do definitely have a problem with danger. People are concerned with safety to a debilitating extent. I think that's true. And it's so fragile in many respects. Hard for us to hear things that we disagree with. This is part of what's so stressful about our political climate. You can't talk about anything without really setting off the other side, whoever it is. What does Romanticism have to say about that? What do you have in mind? I mean, in what I was saying.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to make you answer your own question. I'm just wondering, you seem to be catching on to, you think that the word itself is challenging. I get that.
Well, I was thinking about some of the poems that you were reading to us, and the quieting the storm. We've got this painting out here in the hall, right outside the room. He's asleep in the bow of the ship, right?
Yeah.
A lot of this poetry is about not just standing on a mountain and looking at some peaceful meadow with rabbits hopping around, right? The sea is a very dangerous thing,
Yeah.
right? Like and if you got hurt by it, you might be tempted
Yeah, I
to
hear
say,
you.
we should never go near that thing again.
No, okay.
And
now-
we shouldn't let anybody else go near that thing either.
I think I understand better what you're asking now. I mean, so one little phrase that I used at one point is really, really important for romantics, especially in the German tradition, but also in the English tradition. I had this idea that the core of the reality that we're pursuing, if you could boil it down to a phrase, is the infinite in the finite. They wanted to pursue this transcendent, infinite source as it expresses itself, as God expresses God's self, of course, in the concrete. And they actually were seeking this artistically. They wanted these moments of encounter, which actually frequently are dangerous, or they're upsetting. Moments, as you said, in the life of Christ himself, are fundamentally existentially challenging and require something of you. So I think that I think that broadly speaking, the Romantics were looking for that and wanted that to be a big part of their movement. So they were anti-fragile, I guess, in that sense. Got a fellow here in the front.
All right, I'm gonna ask my own question.
Oh yeah, sure.
Do you want a hard question, an easy question, or both?
Is that your question? That sounds like you just gave me the easy one. Let's go with both, and then
Okay.
I can always dive into one if I don't like.
Okay.
the other.
The easy question is, could you give us a little list, 5, 6, 7 things to read, to listen to look at? I imagine a lot of people here were inspired, and writing down some of the examples that you mentioned.
Okay,
You had
yeah.
some great lines from Blake, right? You mentioned Tchaikovsky's first violin concerto. Could you give us like 6 or 7 poems, paintings, musical pieces that everyone could just rush off and listen to immediately to begin their new romantic lives? That's the easy question. I'll let you answer that one.
Okay. Let's see if I can do this on the spur of the moment. I mean, one thing that sticks out immediately, that came to mind immediately, is by the German author Novalis, whom I mentioned. This is a pen name for a man named Friedrich von Hardenberg. But his name was Novalis, and he wrote a absolutely gorgeous, very short, and I think approachable book of poems called Hymns to the Night, which I think a lot of you would find really, really copacetic. Hymns to the Night, in which he develops a mysticism of the night. And it's very Marian, actually, which is strange because he was Protestant, but he was kind of on this way towards this like really Marian way of thinking when he died, actually. But Hymns to the Night, I think, is a wonderful thing to read. There are a number of things I would recommend by Wordsworth and Keats in the English tradition. For Keats, the easy answer is, I would read the odes of Keats. These are just a couple of pages apiece. The ode to a Grecian urn, the ode to a nightingale, the ode to Psyche I mentioned in the talk. All of his odes, they're some of the greatest poems that have ever been written. They're one of the gateway drugs to poetry, is what one of my college friends used to say about Keats. I think it's true. And then Wordsworth, what would I mention? I think that Wordsworth has some really magnificent sonnets, which I might mention. One of them is called "The World Is Too Much With Us." You may have heard of this one. It's pretty famous, and it's one of the poems that most clearly crystallizes some of these romantic intuitions I've been dealing with. The world is too much with us. Yeah, I don't know if that's 6 or 7. I could go on.
Great.
What was your hard question?
The hard question is, I mean, you've already done some interdisciplinary thinking, right? You've talked about Catholic spirituality, and you've talked about English literature, you've talked about German philosophy. So to ask you to do even more interdisciplinary stuff, I think, is difficult. But I know that in the audience we have some visual artists. I know that we have lots of architects, and I know that we have some scientists. No, those fields, of course, were of interest to the Romantics as well. And I was just wondering if you had any interesting, inspiring thoughts for those particular, for either the visual arts, for the building arts, or for even more difficult in terms of the sciences. If there's a scientist here tonight who says, that's beautiful, but I have no idea how it relates to the periodic table, I wonder if you have any interesting insights into how this romantic vision could also be a motivating force in those academic disciplines as well.
No, that's a great question, and I deserve to be asked that question. Well, so the broad answer is, and you sort of hinted at this in your opening quote from Friedrich Schlegel, who was one of the great thinkers of the German wing of this. He thought, and this is a reflection of their general philosophy, we're all basically trying to do the same thing. There's only one vocation, they thought, and this is what they called poetry. Yes, some of them were writing literal poems, but they thought that anybody writing anything, but also people doing any kind of art, and people doing science, people doing business, people pursuing any vocation in the world, were doing something poetic. We're making a sort of creative response to the world that had been given to them. And this is really what I was talking about in both halves of the paper, the priestly half and the nuptial half. There are two ways of talking about the same thing, which is the one human vocation of receiving the world, receiving the world as a gift, drawing out what you have been given to see in it, that its potential, its clarity, its beauty, drawing it out, giving that back and offering it up. That's the one vocation. That's what they mean by poetry. But that's all of life, you know? That's all of our relationships, but that's also all of the arts and even the sciences, if you think about it the right way. One of my physicist friends, whom is a colleague of mine at Hillsdale, has honestly told me before. He's an astronomer and works with radio astronomy, and he spends a lot of his time in the basement writing programs to synthesize radio telescope data. That is a far distance away from what I do every day. But he has said to me, I think my vocation is looking for the face of Christ in the heavens. And he really meant that, actually. Looking through computers, programs that he's writing to synthesize enormous masses of data. I mean, for me, the guy who likes to go out and touch trees and stuff, I'm like, what is that? But actually, if you sit with it long, I mean, there is something there. He's seeing the phenomena that have been given to him in the stars. He's seeing it under the aspect of number, and he's finding out different ways to talk about it and organize it and explain it better. Right? That's what he's writing with his his programs and developing his techniques in order to handle. So he is actually receiving and giving back with his addition. I think it's all the same vocation, and it's both a vocation for work in the world, and it's a spiritual vocation. It's the path of our sanctification. So I feel like I'm preaching.
Two more questions. One more after this one.
How do we propagate the new Romanticism?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first and most important thing is to be a lover. I mentioned at the start, and that sounds very simple and cheesy, but here's what I mean. I said at the start, I think the best of the Romantics had this understanding that they needed to make a positive response to the problems in the culture. They need to actually show something that is richer and more desirable, that will feed the heart and call to people. I also mentioned there's a quote from this philosopher I love, Chrétien, who says you hear the call in the response. People, if we make our best response, if we try to live a life of love and beauty and creativity and awesomeness, that is our response to what we have been given, people will hear the call in our response. That will help them make their own way, which is going to be different than ours. So I think that's the first and biggest thing is make sure that the core of your life is about your love and not about your fear. Not that you shouldn't be afraid of anything, right? But not about your fear or your anxiety, your critiques that you have of things and people and okay, fair enough, all of that. But is that the core of my life? Is that what the heart of my life bears witness to? I think people who love and make a beautiful offering with their life change the world. I mean, I think it's like I said, it's a very old and simple thing to say, but I think it's been true in my life. I mean, that's how I've found the things that I have has been through encountering these kinds of people. Anyway, there's more to be said.
Okay, one last question.
Could you kind of explain more what you mean by a positive response or like positive romanticism as opposed to maybe negative romanticism?
I don't know if you want me to go into negative romanticism. There's a dark side of romanticism and a lot of weirdness that's possible. All I will say about it is this. They were in general obsessed with this idea of encountering the eternal in time and the infinite in the finite. These divine encounters in everyday things, as I said. Okay, and that's really you can do a lot of really blissed out art that way, as I said. But think about if you think maybe the world is maybe you have that idea that the infinite is always breaking into the finite world, but you're not sure that it's for you. It's actually, maybe it's against me. Maybe it's actually grinding me down and haunting me. And the horror tradition actually emerges out of the dark side of Romanticism. The Gothic literature of the 19th century, or H.P. Lovecraft in the early 20th century, it all comes out of this dark side of being obsessed with these kind of transcendent forces breaking into our world. But if they're not good, if they're not coming to me out of love, that could be horrifying. Okay, that's one dark side of Romanticism, which is possible if you don't have if you don't have the help of faith in the right kinds of ways. Okay, that's just one dark thing. The positive side. I think I'm reiterating what I already said, but the positive kind of response is a response of love and affirmation of what is good, of responding with your own to the world as a gift, with your own counter gift, right? Which is both affirming what you have received and adding something to it, giving it back. That's what every great poem is. Every great poem, and every great piece of music too, is about something that beautiful that you have received. You are kind of catching the experience of receiving it, giving it back with the coloration of your heart and your mind and your unique personality. You're giving it back with that addition. That's positive, you know. That adds something. Positive in the literal sense of adding something affirmative and loving. So.
Thank you so much to all of you. You made this an important evening, and thanks as well to Dr. Lindley.